everybody. My name is Dr. Jo Twist. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Ukie Interactive Entertainment. We are the Games and Interactive Entertainment Trade Network representing companies across the UK. I am very delighted to be part of the games industry at what I think is a really critical time for the sector. Games and the games industry is a $100 billion global revenue business. We're faster growing than film and TV globally. We have around 2,000 companies from Cornwall to Dundee who are making games in this country, which not a lot of people know. We also have this wonderful position as the game sector that we occupy, which is this very, very nice apex and sweet spots between culture, creativity, storytelling, and content, and high-tech innovation and technology. And I think it's fair to say that the games industry, despite its youth, it's younger than me. I know you'll find that really hard to believe, all of you, yes. It's about 40 years old, and we are a very young sector, but we've always been born digital. Digital is in our DNA. So therefore, we're really early adopters of technology. We roll with transitions and technological change. So VR and AR, of course, is something that obviously the games industry would be grabbing the horns of and leading in terms of development, and that's what this panel is here today to talk you through. So I want to just introduce my panel first. First, on the far right, we have Piers, who's head of games research for IHS Technology. So he's the man with all the facts and figures and the insight and the analysis. Right?
Right. You, yes, right.
Next to him, we have Phil, who is marketing manager for Draw and Code, a fantastic Liverpool-based company who's doing some very, very cool things in AR and in VR, and really occupying that wonderful world between games and entertainment and applied technologies and fun. And then finally, we have Patrick, who's the CEO of nDreams, who is really, I think, the biggest and the first UK games company who's really just dedicated to creating fantastic VR experiences, and we'll hear from him and some of his learnings. So we always hear these kind of figures about the size of the market and how exciting it is. But I want to just open up, first of all, by asking my panelists what your favorite VR or AR experience or content or project is. And it could be a historical one, because as we know, it's been around for some time. Patrick, starting with you.
I've got two, I would say. I have to say Tilt Brush. I think there's something very, very special about using Tilt Brush for the first time on Vive and just drawing in 3D and looking around. It's a truly special product and really gives a great example of how powerful VR. And something a bit more recent, Batman VR on the PlayStation VR, which I played over the weekend with my kids, was really awesome. Some great titles on there, but I really enjoyed that. It looked beautiful. So probably those two for me now.
Well, I was going to say Tilt Brush as well, but yeah, I'm not going to be boring and say the same thing. I'm actually, this is a little bit of a boring answer. I'm going to go for the Lab on the HTC Vive, which anybody who's got one or anyone who's played it will know that is the kind of default little kind of suite of mini games that's within it. But for me, that nails what VR gaming should be about, in the same way that when you first got a Nintendo Wii and you got Wii Sports with it, and you felt for the first few weeks you didn't even need another game, you didn't need your Mario Galaxies or whatever else, because it nailed the Wii experience so well and you really got it after playing with that. And that's how I feel about the Lab. If you haven't played it, please do.
I'm going to plump for an augmented reality application. And I've demoed Minecraft through the HoloLens, and there are limitations with the HoloLens experience, but actually playing Minecraft on a tabletop in front of you is a mind-blowing experience for anyone who's into Minecraft and who's played it on a 2D screen. Actually having it in 3D and being able to manipulate it, pull it up so you can see the caves underneath and all that kind of aspect is very interesting in terms of augmented reality. And I hope, that comes to a sort of wearable experience very soon.
I mean, it's fantastic because, lots of people describe this as sort of smoke and mirrors sometimes when we see demos, but sometimes people describe it as magic. VR developers are magicians, and that's what I prefer. Piers, I just want to talk a little bit, touching on figures.
Sure,
what are the figures that you have in terms of the forecast? Because we see all these figures, and sometimes they can be quite confusing, and who knows if they're going to come to reality and so on. But some pretty big bets being made based on some of the forecasts.
Yeah, a lot of the numbers don't really mean a lot. I mean, they come out with huge hundreds of billions of numbers, and I think they sort of aggregate augmented reality and virtual reality, and they also sort of extend that to a large amount of the value chain, the hardware and all this kind of stuff. Our numbers, we've just done some research into the VR sector, published our latest numbers. We're forecasting 18 million installed base of VR headsets at the end of this year. 86% of those will be smartphone VR based, so a very small proportion will be the higher end headsets, which we expect to actually monetize the content more significantly, that smaller portion. Our outlook for 2020 is 80 million VR headsets as an install base addressable market. Again, a majority of those will be smartphone VR. We're forecasting that Google Daydream will actually be the biggest platform by that point. But on the other side, the high-end headsets, where the monetization, I think, of the content will take place, will increasingly, with a slow up-ramp, will increasingly grow their install base. And to get something relatively meaningful. In terms of this year, the Gear VR is really the platform which has the best addressable market. Of around, we're forecasting for the end of this year about 5.5 million globally.
I mean, it's interesting because there are some big bets being made. There are people who are, really heavily investing in this area. But, when we try and look at success, I think the games industry and game developers in general are pretty good at trying things and failing. The famous kind of overnight success story of taking 50 or so games for Rovio to get to Angry Birds. So what does success look like in terms of a successful game or a game experience? And what will success look like for you, Patrick?
I think at the moment, success is finding really interesting new mechanics and types of games that are great fun and getting a good reaction from them. For us, next year, we hope to be, breaking even, and then moving onwards from that, it'll be about making money as a business. But for now, I think it's so early, and the VR install bases are so small that you have to think more about quality and about innovation and about learning and understanding fast than you do about making lots of money. It is too early to be making lots of money as a developer at the moment, but it's getting there.
What about you, Phil? What does success look like?
Well, for us as a company, we primarily are a client-serving company. So as we're touching on, it just takes a few people going, wow, and that's kind of our business made. But in terms of the wider industry, people keep asking, will it be a success? Will it be mainstream? And for me, I don't think we can answer that, and I don't think we know, and I'm not even sure it really matters right now, because we all have phones, we all have TVs, but we don't have a cinema in our home. And that's still, despite not being ubiquitous, not being in every single building in the country, it's still a perfectly viable, huge, giant, culturally influential business. So I think it's something that our industry needs to keep asking that to ourselves. Will the ultimate virtual reality experiences be out of the home? Will they be in the home? Will they be in your pocket? Will they be on your PC? I don't think we truly know the answer to this, so it's really hard to say, as somebody who develops software, exactly what our kind of clients will look like in 5 or 10 years' time, or what our products will look like. We kind of know where it is now, but where it's going, it's really tough to say.
I think it's interesting as well when we talk about industries and sectors, and of course, my job is to represent games and interactive entertainment, but I think sometimes people can sort of put games over here as something that's not quite as serious as medical application. Can you talk to me a little bit about, Patrick, in your view, what makes game development talent kind of uniquely adopting VR, and what makes that talent special when, in terms of designing these kinds of experiences? Why has the games industry really taken to this?
I think particularly in the UK, we've got a great track record of very strong 3D game development. So, with the PlayStation and the Sega consoles and Nintendo, we've been very good at creating beautiful 3D worlds, telling stories in games, and some games telling stories not through cutscenes, but through you walking through the world and the story happens around you. And it turns out that for VR, that's exactly what you want to do. VR is all about creating great 3D worlds and 3D characters and 3D objects. And, where other countries maybe have been ahead in terms of 2D 3D mobile gaming, I think suddenly now those 3D skills are something that as a country we're very, very good at, and there's a lot of game developers that are very good at that. So there's a lot of techniques that work well in VR that game developers have been using for years and years and years, and I think that uniquely makes game developers, it's a great starting point for them. And so many developers are so excited by VR and what they can do, mainly because VR acts as an emotion amplifier. You know, when you're in VR, all your emotions are so much more powerful than they are on a screen or on a phone. You actually believe you're there, and that's great. It's fantastic for game designers because you can really take advantage of those emotions.
I think the point is that the 2D video industry or the movie making industry, the processes there do not align to 360 work processes, whereas the game sector aligns, almost exactly. There's skills and design experience that needs to be developed, but actually the mapping from the games industry onto the VR industry is almost exactly matched. Transitioning from the 2D video industry to the 360 VR industry is a much tougher proposition.
And also the other big thing is the tools used as well. So it's not just, as you're saying, the kind of perspective and philosophy and experience of game makers, but it's the tools that they're being used. So now we'll have clients such as architects come to us, and obviously they're already using 3D models. Some of the best 3D models are made by architects. They're stunning. But now they're starting to have in-house. They're starting to have Unity developers. So it's something that, as people who work with games, you'll be very familiar with your Unity and Unreal and other 3D engines. And they're starting to creep into other places. I've been into a hospital recently where they've got Oculus setups and they've got people developing for Unity and developing in 3D right there. So it's a great time for the games industry because it means that the world is looking to us for the answers around VR and AR.
I guess I think that I find that endlessly fascinating again because we are quite used to, even in a kind of just a normal game experience where you're not breaking down that fourth wall, you often have these kind of creative challenges about telling story, right? I mean, in your experience, Patrick, what are some of those, I guess, creative learnings or technical challenges that you've encountered thus far in your journey compared to just making games for, normally, if you like?
There are loads. I mean, the big obvious things are movement in VR is a huge challenge, and there are lots and lots of interesting ways of solving that so it's comfortable for players. Subtitles and user interface on, most games have health bars and lives and text on screen, but you can't draw in front of everything in VR because that would be on your eyeballs. So where do you put that text and what happens when you look around? That kind of stuff's quite a challenge. And cutscenes, a lot of games rely on cutscenes to tell story, but cutscenes don't work very nicely in games. So it's about using the environment to tell stories and artists, there are lots of challenges. Audio's got to be so much more powerful because it makes the experience very special. If you get 3D audio right, you've got to draw behind things. You can't hide underneath the desks like you would normally do because people might look underneath them. So you have to do so much more detail in the worlds, and people want to get in close and look at stuff. So they're the sort of big things I think we've been looking at.
And I mean, I guess how is that sort of learning, affecting the types of games that you design and want to make?
For us, that's the most exciting thing about VR is that there are going to be new genres of games and new gameplay mechanics, and we're doing an awful lot of prototyping, just trying ideas out. Oh, that might be fun. Would that work? Really simple grey box stuff to see what works and what doesn't. And what's working well is not Call of Duty in VR. It's not taking existing games that have been big and porting them over. It's creating new types of gameplay, new types of control systems, new types of cameras, and that's fun. That's really exciting. So you will see definitely new genres come out in VR that weren't around before, and that's very exciting as a developer.
Phil?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of challenges. I think what you were saying about UI is very important. That has to be totally rethought. First-person 3D gaming is already, to some degree, is suitable for VR. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close. But UI is the big challenge when you're talking about VR gaming. But it's also just trying to present the right things to people. So as you're saying, a Call of Duty might not be appropriate. It might actually be, okay, we know most people are going to be sat down in this game, as they're playing with the VR headset on. So let's do something when naturally you feel like you're in a seat, or thinking about the kind of restrictions on movement. I played a great game that was developed by the team at Ripstone in Liverpool, and they thought about, at the time they didn't have it was for the PlayStation VR, Project Morpheus as it was at the time, and they didn't have access to the Move controls at the time. So they just went, okay, a lot of people will have the DualShock normal PlayStation controller. So they made this game where in the entire game your hands are tied together. So you're sat there and it feels really convincing when you look down. You really do think you're looking at your hands. So sometimes it's being aware of the restrictions you've got and replaying with them, because particularly, if you think about music is always, it's a formula, and it's just that little tweak to the formula, and just playing with those boundaries is where the most satisfaction tends to be drawn in music. And I feel it's the same with VR, where don't be afraid of the limitations, play with them, get right up against them, and don't be afraid to experiment with them.
Talking about interface and the different types of controllers and interface, have you found that having to deal with a multitude of different interfaces is quite a challenge? Because having talked to a lot of developers, they seems to be one of the big feedbacks. And
yeah, it is a pain, particularly in that you've got controller support and touch control support. And from my point of view, touch control will be the default standard. It's so natural, it's so intuitive, but Oculus Touches aren't out yet. And PlayStation in Europe has controllers and doesn't come bundled with Move controllers. So you've got, at the moment, this kind of dichotomy. You're supporting controllers and you're also supporting touch controls, and that's quite tricky as a developer. I'll be really looking forward to a couple of years' time where you just support hand motion controllers.
I can imagine if you're building a multi-platform title, say you're building it for the HTC Vive with the idea of having a room scale capability, but you're wanting to address a larger audience by going multi-platform, then you have to kind of build it for the lowest common denominator, and it sort of undermines the potential of your content on that platform as well. So I think that's a key challenge to think about in this early stages.
I mean, Piers, again, because we are in this sort of experimental phase, and I tend to ignore people who say, it's going to fail. I still think there's a lot of experimentation. What do you fear, in terms of how the projections and the forecasts and the sort of hype builds? What do you see the sort of common pitfalls or some of the worries that you have around that?
I think at this stage, one of the key ones is looking at the return on your investment. You have to be realistic about how well, depending on what you're doing. If you're trying to sell a premium product, you have to be really realistic about how it's going to perform in the market and not overextend yourself in terms of your investment. There's a lot riding on kind of realism, people trying to create very real experiences that reflect the virtual world, and that is a very expensive thing to do. Whereas I think those that have gone along a sort of different path where they're producing something which fits into their kind of investment schedule in a more kind of competent way, then I think they are setting themselves up for a more successful future.
And I guess, again, in the games industry, we have a very good relationship with our community of players and our audience, if you like. Some people call them audiences, we call them community. Phil, how does that affect, and what difference does that make, sort of understanding the community from a developer's perspective?
Well, the big thing is, I think software developers are their own community. They are their own fans. That doesn't mean we love ourselves. I mean, as in, we really get it and really understand it. And last week I was in London for the Brand Licensing Europe conference, and that was mainly around kind of toys and entertainment brands. And it felt so different turning up at a technology conference. A technology conference, everybody tries to understand as much as they can every facet of the industry. They're so passionate about it, and the passion in VR and AR is so amazing to see. There's so much. It's not blind belief, but just belief that this industry will change the world. It will have a big cultural impact. And so I think that to some degree, maybe this won't apply to all developers, but certainly the ones that I've worked with, they really understand what they're offering because they want to kind of please themselves. I don't think it's that much of a challenge to them. I'm sure, the bigger the company gets and the bigger a project is, you need to research it and you need to, look into your audience more and more. But generally, these people who are making games are the same people who are playing games, and it's something that's really natural to them.
It's not always a good thing when it's 19% females, but never mind, that's fine. We'll skip over that.
I think the testing though is a real challenge, because if you're thinking about your investments that you've got to make, going to an outside lab to have your content tested, which is a very iterative process, I think, for virtual reality content, because you're tweaking things to build the immersion, to build this successful experience. So, it ends up that you do a lot of, I think, in-house, you get people in to try and test the experience. And you try and do that in an unbiased way. It's quite a challenge, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Patrick, how do you go about doing that audience testing and sort of prototyping with the audience? Because, again, games and particularly, well, all games now rely so heavily on analytics and data about user behavior down to the second in every single game. So how do you go about doing that audience testing?
Well, we do quite a lot of user testing with prototypes as we go through development. So we get people into the studio and get them to play. We do a lot of testing with people on other teams as well, but also friends and family. We get people in and just get their reaction. We don't do testing at the beginning. We don't ask people what they want to see in VR. We're trying stuff out. We're trying to see what works, and we feel like we can do that bit. But in terms of, is this fun? How does this work? Is the controllers, does the control work? Is stuff obvious? Do you get stuck? What's confusing? You can't beat user testing. One interesting thing you mentioned, talking about challenges, is there's business models at the moment. It's very, very hard to... in fact, you can't justify spending 50 million, 100 million on a huge AAA game in VR and people are expecting Skyrim or Red Dead Redemption in VR because they want these big games. But at the moment, the market is so small, games have to be a lot cheaper than that. And so there's, I think, a bit of a gap at the moment between these killer apps that people want to see, which are huge AAA, $100 million dollar games, and what publishers and developers can actually justify and afford at the moment. So you'll see the quality, the scope, the scale of the games grow over time as the install base grows, and I think it's important that consumers understand that as well.
I'm slightly concerned about big franchise games which are coming with VR modes, which are seems a little bit like they're tacking on VR experiences, and I don't think that's particularly good to sort of build the industry. So I'm slightly concerned about that. I mean, I think PlayStation, because of its relationships with the largest publishers and its catalogue of content on the PlayStation 4, has the chance to get big branded content which will drive interest in and it's already done that, obviously, with Batman, etc.
When I often do talks or talk to different kinds of audiences, it tends to be a lot of film and TV people who are very, very interested in VR, and potentially, I think people see that as this kind of bridge between game experiences and more sophisticated film or TV experiences. Patrick, what do you think? How do you imagine that's going to play out? Is it going to play out, do you think? And what do you think TV film sectors need to learn, and vice versa, games developers need to learn from the TV and film?
I think it's got huge potential, and if you go to any of the US VR shows, it's much more about TV and video than games. It seems to be a bit of a reverse to here. A lot of the VC-funded companies in the US are video TV companies. Hollywood are very excited about it. I think 3D, 360-degree film is amazing. What I think it needs is interactivity. You need to be able to do something, and that's where I think there's going to be a great combination in the future between developers and filmmakers, where they can bring the skills of filming and doing photogrammetry of places and mapping real places beautifully, but with interactivity, with the ability for users and players to actually change things. But I'm a huge believer in VR video. I can't wait to see live news broadcasts from events around the world where I can look around in 3D and 360 and actually feel like I'm there. That's going to be really special. And some of the films that companies like Jaunt are working on sound incredibly cool. So I think I'm quite bullish about it.
Phil, how about you?
Yeah, I think 360 can be incredible when it's done well. 360 video, but I do feel it's a stepping stone. I feel like we're going to head towards, I don't know if you've seen things like the Lightro camera, which there's a particularly advanced version which I think right now doesn't really exist outside a lab, but it basically 3D scans the room, so you're no longer talking about mattering where the camera is placed. Wherever it's placed in the room, you'll be able to navigate around that room in full 3D. And we've done some experience with that. We've at Draw and Code, we've used Microsoft's Kinect, which is the most underrated piece of kit in the universe, fantastic thing. And we've used that to make virtual reality music video and a documentary where you're given complete freedom to move around. Now, the computers can't really handle the amount of data that is thrown out by 3D scanners at the moment. I think it was like 30-something gig for a 3-minute video, and when you see it, it's creaky to say the least. It's not, it's not perfect at all, and would fill up your average phone in one hit, one video made like this. But for me, 360 video and games at the moment are kind of two separate things, very separate things, but they will come together with technologies like Lightro and full 3D scanning. And that for me is where this will ultimately end up. And I do think it will be a kind of cinema-style experience. I do believe that we will have many films, and a lot longer at the moment than the 5 to 15-minute films we're seeing at the moment. I think people will get more comfortable with VR. I think the experience will be better. There'll be more interactivity, more freedom to roam, and I think that is definitely where film is heading. It's just not quite there yet.
Great. We have a couple of minutes, and I'm just wondering if there's any questions from the audience. There's one at the back, and do we have a microphone? Yep.
It's not. Oh, it's on now. Hi everyone. My question is, what do you think of John Carmack's statements a couple of weeks ago, Oculus Connect, where he said that the VR industry is coasting on novelty?
I think there's an element of truth to that. A lot of developers have come in and been learning and trying to understand how VR works, and the low-hanging fruit of that is doing stuff that's different and quirky. It's you're seeing a lot of horror because it's really easy to do horror in VR, and a lot of physics-based stuff because it's easy to do that with touch controls and things. I think that was always going to happen, because developers are exploring. I think what you'll see now is developers moving from that into creating much richer, much more detailed worlds. I think there is some truth in what he said, but that was always going to happen, and I think you'll see that development happening as we move through next year and then into 2018.
Well, for me, I think novelty is not a bad thing. I remember when I first got an iPhone, there was no app store, so straight away VR is ahead of where mobile, was certainly where Apple was when they released the iPhone. It took some months for it to appear, and then that was a lot of novelty stuff. I remember, probably many of you will have done it, the Carling app where you pretend to drink a beer, and obviously that's nowhere near as good as actually drinking a beer, but everybody would use it, and I think that was really key for us. We were kind of a different software development company at the time, and at the time we weren't working with mobile and weren't working with apps, and I remember little promotional apps and little playful things like that. They were entirely novelty. That's all they were. And for us, that inspired us, and we started saying, well, if you could get, a touch screen, a gyroscope, and whatever else is in this phone, and you could make that happen, what else could you make happen? So I think we're not, the VR industry is not based on novelty as much as it could be right now, and I think that will only lessen. I don't think it's a bad thing at all to be playful with it right now.
I was just going to say, I feel like we're at the Nickelodeon stage if we compare it to cinema. So we're coming out of the Nickelodeon stage maybe, where people were just happy to see a steam train on the screen or a horse running because they'd never seen that before. Yeah. So that was the novelty stage. Yeah. And then we quickly went into things like D.W. Griffith and Birth of a Nation and stuff like that. And I feel like we're just moving into that phase at the moment. So we had a really good talk from Andrew Lacey this morning, who was saying that it feels like we're in the mobile industry in 2004. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. Everyone has to remember, VR that you see now isn't VR. This is just 1.0. This is just the starting point. And what you'll see over the next 5 years is it being revolutionized and transforming. And that's going to be exciting. This is just the beginning. This is a brick phone stage.
One final question at the front here. If we can just get the microphone, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close. No, here, front row.
Thank you. All the great things that are being learned from developments and innovations in the gaming community, like how to stop sickness and things like that, are they being shared with other VR communities that are trying to make developments, like healthcare? You said, are the great developments, are they being made to be made of use, or is there a gap that needs to be bridged?
I think generally the technology sector is relatively open. Certainly at the software development sort of side is relatively open, and I'm seeing a lot of sharing, a lot of what's being learned by one person is being shared by another, but whether that's enough, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a doctor myself, and I was looking at all the literature on virtual reality in medical education, because there's a easy to see path there. Yeah. And things like a computer game on a 2D screen, it was being called virtual reality, and for someone for the community here, it's that's not really virtual reality. Yeah. So I think between people that are really important in the medical sector and people that are making big developments in VR, there's a massive gap, and they're kind of thirsty.
Maybe you can have a way of bridging that gap.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. Create a conference. There you go. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your question, and thank you very much to my wonderful panel. Please give them a round of applause, and thank you.
Thank you.